In the summer of 1944, 3 American bombers appeared over one of the most unexpected places on Earth: Soviet airspace. They weren't enemies. They weren't spies. They were simply lost, running on fumes after a raid against Japanese targets in Manchuria. But when their wheels touched Soviet soil, they unknowingly handed Joseph Stalin the key to America's most advanced secret of the war. It began on July 29th. The Boeing B-29 Ramp Tramp had taken off from Chengdu, China, bound for Manchurian steelworks. Hours later, one engine started to smoke, another lost power, and the fuel gauges dropped toward zero. Commander Howard Garrell had no choice. He turned north toward what he thought was friendly territory. As the silver bomber descended through low clouds, the men on board could see the coastline of Vladivostok, the farthest edge of their allies' empire. They expected rescue. Instead, they met silence. Soviet officers surrounded the plane, weapons ready, but uncertain. The United States and the Soviet Union were technically allies against Germany, yet Moscow still maintained neutrality with Japan. Helping the Americans would mean breaking that neutrality, something Stalin had no intention of doing. Under international law, the Soviets were allowed to intern the aircraft and its crew. To the Americans, it sounded like protection. In reality, it meant imprisonment. Garrell and his crew were separated, questioned, and sent to remote barracks in Central Asia. Their beloved superfortress was rolled into a guarded hangar and covered with tarps. The same happened a few weeks later, when another bomber, the Ding Hao, made an emergency landing nearby. Then came the third, the General H.H. Arnold Special. 3 of the most advanced aircraft in the world now rested on Soviet runways, and not a single American would see them again. Washington demanded their return. Moscow responded with diplomatic silence. For Stalin, these bombers were a miracle, a gift dropped from the sky. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was unlike anything in the Soviet arsenal. A pressurized cockpit, remote-controlled gun turrets, and engines producing over 2,000 horsepower each. It could fly more than 5,000 kilometers, with 5 tons of bombs, farther than any Soviet aircraft could dream of reaching. Developing it had cost the United States over $3 billion, more than the entire Manhattan Project. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin studied scale models of the plane with a calculating calm. Soviet bombers like the Petlyakov P-8 were slow, heavy, and outdated, relics of a pre-war world. The Americans, meanwhile, were already flying at the edge of the stratosphere. The difference was not just technological, it was psychological. Owning a B-29 meant more than matching American engineering. It meant rewriting the rules of global power. That night, Stalin spoke quietly to his aides. "We will not buy this," he said. "We will build it." He didn't mean inspiration. He meant duplication. Every panel, every wire, every imperfection. It would be the beginning of the most audacious case of industrial espionage in history. And for one man in Moscow, a brilliant, exhausted engineer named Andrei Tupolev, it would soon become a matter of life and death. June 6, 1945. Europe had barely caught its breath after victory when Andrei Tupolev was summoned to the Kremlin. The message was brief: report immediately to Comrade Stalin. Tupolev was 58, already a legend in Soviet aviation, and a survivor of Stalin's prisons. He knew what such a summons could mean. Inside the marble hall, the air was still, the temperature uncomfortably cold. Stalin stood at the table, surrounded by models of the captured American bombers. "Comrade Tupolev," he began, "you will copy this aircraft completely. 2 years, not a day more. There was no room for interpretation. Copy did not mean inspiration or adaptation. It meant replication. Every rivet, every wire, even the paint on the control panels. The smallest deviation could be read as sabotage. And for Tupolev, who had only recently been released from a sharashka, a secret prison labor design bureau, the meaning was clear: success or death. Within weeks, Moscow launched what would become one of the most extraordinary engineering projects of the 20th century. 3 disassembled B-29s were transported to a secured hangar near Moscow. Teams of engineers began to catalog every piece, more than 100,000 individual parts. Every cable, every nut, every hydraulic pipe received a number, a photograph, and a technical report. It was an act of national reverse engineering on a scale never seen before. 60 design bureaus, 900 factories, and over 100,000 workers were mobilized. The task seemed impossible. America's aircraft industry used the imperial system: inches, feet, fractions. The Soviets lived in millimeters. A sheet of aluminum, 1/16 of an inch thick, simply didn't exist in Soviet production. To match the measurements, entire industrial plants had to be retooled. Rolling mills were redesigned. New alloys created. Soviet engineers replaced the American 24ST aluminum with a homegrown alloy known as D16T. The difference in composition might seem small, but every tiny variation affected weight, durability, and balance. The same problem repeated everywhere. Wiring standards, screws, fuel pumps, all had to be reinvented in Soviet terms. Each subsystem became a separate research project. The effort turned the entire Soviet aviation industry into a single, sleepless organism. Supervision came from Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD and Stalin's most feared lieutenant. His visits froze the air in every corridor. Engineers stopped speaking when his shadow passed. Beria did not shout. He simply took notes. Everyone knew what those notes could mean. Yet beneath the fear, something remarkable began to happen. Young technicians saw the inside of the most advanced machine on Earth for the first time. They studied the logic of American design, the simplicity, the precision, the discipline of mass production. For many of them, it was a revelation, proof that technology could be elegant as well as efficient. By autumn, Tupolev's teams were producing their first drawings. They were building not just an airplane, but a reflection of another civilization. The deeper they went, the more they understood that copying perfection required its own kind of genius. Then came the problem that no blueprint could solve: a small, mysterious hole in the left wing, unconnected to any system. A manufacturing defect, perhaps, or a clue left by chance. The engineers hesitated. Should they leave it out or include it? The decision would travel straight to the Kremlin. And in Stalin's world, even a single misplaced hole could decide a man's fate. The engineers stood around the wing in silence. Under the harsh glare of the hangar lights, a single round hole stared back at them, perfectly drilled, yet serving no purpose. It wasn't on any blueprint. It connected to nothing. For days, no one dared to act. When the question finally reached Tupolev, his answer was short and cold. Comrade Stalin ordered an exact copy, he said. If the Americans built it with a hole, we built it with a hole. And so they did. Every prototype of the Soviet bomber would carry that tiny imperfection, reproduced with mathematical precision. It became a symbol of fear, of obedience, and of the absurd perfection demanded by the regime. By late 1946, The project had consumed the country. Entire factories were reconfigured to produce parts no one had ever made before. Workers labored 18 hours a day, sleeping between machines. Draftsmen filled kilometers of paper with blueprints, their pencils never leaving the page. The atmosphere was suffocating. Beria's inspectors moved silently through the corridors, taking notes. Delays were treated as treason. Miscalculations could be fatal. A rumor spread of an engineer who questioned an American cable design. He was never seen again. Whether the story was true no longer mattered. Fear was enough to keep everyone moving. Tupolev himself understood better than anyone what failure meant. Just a few years earlier, he had been designing aircraft behind barbed wire, sentenced as an enemy of the people. Now, he was building the Kremlin's dream machine, but the walls still felt the same. Despite the pressure, the technical challenges were staggering. The B-29's fuel system used 18 self-sealing tanks connected by electrically controlled valves, a masterpiece of complexity. Soviet rubber couldn't withstand aviation fuel, so chemists developed new synthetic compounds from scratch. When the first tests leaked under pressure, Tupolev simply ordered, "Do it again." Then came the electronics. The American bombers carried miles of wiring, advanced radio systems, and gyroscopic instruments no Soviet factory could reproduce. The General Electric remote-controlled gun turrets were a mystery in themselves, a fusion of mechanics and early automation. Engineers from the Moscow Aviation Institute spent months trying to reverse engineer the aiming system, their desks covered with disassembled motors and tangled wires. Each problem became its own battle. A fuel valve that wouldn't seal, a gun control circuit that refused to synchronize. Even the transparent canopy glass had to be recreated with a new formula of silica and heat-resistant polymers. Every success felt like a small miracle. The project had turned into something larger than espionage. It was survival through engineering. The men and women working on the aircraft no longer copied just to obey. They copied to prove that they could match the world's best with nothing but persistence and fear. By early 1947, 3 complete airframes stood on the factory floor, one for flight testing, one for destruction, and one as a reference model. The smell of oil, aluminum, and sweat hung heavy in the air. As Tupolev walked among the gleaming metal giants, he touched the cold fuselage of the first prototype and whispered to his deputy, "If this one flies, we all live." Outside, the snow is melting. Soon, the engines would roar for the first time, and every person who had worked in that hangar would hold their breath, because the next few minutes would decide whether this impossible copy would ever leave the ground. May 19th, 1947. The morning sky over Zhukovsky Airfield was pale and windless, the kind of stillness that felt like a held breath. For 2 years, thousands of people had worked without rest, without doubt, and mostly without hope. Now everything depended on one machine. 3 prototypes stood ready. The first would fly, the second would be pushed to destruction in stress tests, and the third would remain untouched, the sacred reference copy. Each of them looked like an American B-29, down to the last rivet. But only one question mattered. Would the Soviet version actually fly? At 11 in the morning, test pilot Nikolai Rydko climbed the ladder into the cockpit of the lead aircraft. He was calm, almost expressionless. Around him, the crew prepared checklists written in careful, nervous handwriting. 4 massive ASH-73 engines waited, silent and cold. On the control tower balcony, Andrei Tupolev stood beside his deputies. his hands clasped behind his back. He said nothing. He couldn't. The engines started one by one, a low mechanical growl building into a thunder that rolled across the airfield. Flames licked from the exhausts as the propellers blurred into silver discs. Mechanics cleared the runway. Technicians watched from behind sandbags. Beria's men stood motionless near the hangars, their black coats unmoving. At 11:17 a.m., Rybko pushed the throttles forward. The bomber began to roll, heavy and slow, gathering speed along the concrete strip. 70, 80, 90 miles per hour, still grounded. Then, almost imperceptibly, the nose lifted. The wheels left the earth. The aircraft rose into the sky with the deliberate grace of something too heavy to believe in miracles. From the control tower, Tupolev exhaled for the first time in minutes. His engineers shouted. Some wept openly. The Soviet B-29, now called the Bull, was airborne. It weighed only 340 kilograms more than the American original. The difference was statistically irrelevant, but emotionally colossal. For 30 minutes, Rybko circled the field, testing controls, engines, hydraulics. Every system held. Then he brought the bomber down, touching the runway as gently as if it were glass. The hangars erupted in applause. Somewhere in the crowd, a factory worker whispered, "He saved us all." 2 months later, during the Aviation Day parade at Tikhino, Moscow's skies delivered Stalin's ultimate spectacle. 3 silver bombers thundered over the capital in perfect formation. Western military attachés in the crowd froze. They instantly recognized the silhouette. B-29s. American B-29s with red stars. Panic spread through the observation stands. How many had the Soviets built? 3? 6? 12? In truth, it was the same 3 planes, flying the route twice. A masterstroke of Soviet stagecraft. But the message was clear. The monopoly of the skies was over. For the first time, the United States could imagine Soviet bombers reaching its own shores. And for the men who had built the machine, fear turned to a fierce, exhausted pride. From his office that evening, Tupolev wrote a single line in his diary. "The aircraft has flown. We have done the impossible." But in the Kremlin, Stalin was already thinking ahead. The copy was not enough. The bomber had to become a weapon, one capable of carrying the ultimate symbol of power, the atomic bomb. Stalin had achieved what no one thought possible, a perfect copy of America's most advanced bomber. But he didn't build it just to fly. He built it to threaten. Mass production began almost immediately after the first flight. 3 factories in Kazan, Samara, and Moscow were ordered to work around the clock. Every machine, every worker, every bolt in the Soviet Union now had a single purpose: to turn the American B-29 into a Soviet weapon. Within 5 years, more than 800 Tu-4 bombers would roll out of the assembly lines, each one demanding nearly 2 million man-hours of labor. The project drained resources on a scale rivaling the atomic program itself. But for Stalin, it was worth every ounce of effort. For the first time in history, the Soviet Union possessed a bomber that could cross oceans and reach the United States, or at least make the world believe it could. Soon came the next step, arming it with nuclear power. Engineers modified the aircraft to carry the RDS-3, the Soviet Union's third-generation atomic bomb. On October 18, 1951, at the Semipalatinsk test range in Kazakhstan, a modified Tu-4A climbed into the sky with a strange, unnatural weight under its belly. At 400 meters above the steppe, the bomb detonated with the force of 40 kilotons. A flash turned night into day, and a shockwave rippled across the desert. For the first time, the Soviet Union had delivered a nuclear weapon from the air. The world had changed forever. To Western analysts, it was a terrifying revelation. Until that day, the United States had believed its homeland untouchable. Now, across the Arctic Circle, Soviet bombers could, in theory, reach American soil. Even if they couldn't return, the idea alone was enough to reshape global strategy. The balance of fear, the logic of deterrence, was born that day on the wings of a stolen design. Yet the Tu-4's legacy went beyond military might. Copying the B-29 forced the Soviet Union to modernize every corner of its aviation industry: metallurgy, precision tooling, mass production, electronics. Thousands of young engineers learned techniques that had never existed in the USSR before. Within a few years, those same engineers would design truly original aircraft: the jet-powered Tu-16, the massive turboprop Tu-95, machines that would define Soviet aviation for decades. Andrei Tupolev, once a prisoner in a labor camp, now stood among the heroes of the state. He received the Stalin Prize and was fully rehabilitated. The man who had been ordered to copy someone else's genius had, in the process, created an empire of his own. When Stalin died in 1953, 10 Tu-4 bombers were gifted to Mao's China, symbolizing the spread of Soviet influence across Asia. Those aircraft would keep flying and bombing until the late 1980s. Long after their creator was gone, his copy still filled the skies. Decades later, as Soviet archives opened, one file contained a curious note from the Tu-4's design phase. A simple sketch of a wing with a small, useless hole. The caption read, "To be replicated exactly." That hole had once symbolized blind obedience, but in hindsight, it told a different story of a nation that turned imitation into innovation and fear into power. So what do you think? Was the Tu-4 a triumph of Soviet ingenuity, or the greatest act of technological theft in history? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more untold chapters of World War II and the Cold War, because history's greatest secrets are still waiting to take flight. Texas, 1944. The sun over the plains didn't care who had won the war. It burned down on everything: the barbed wire, the wooden towers, the whitewashed barracks that shimmered in the heat. Inside the fences of Camp Hearn, a group of German women stood in silence, their faces pale under the hard light. They were prisoners of war, shipped halfway across the world from a collapsing Europe to the open land of Texas. Most of them had been secretaries, medics, or clerks for the German army. They were not soldiers, but in that summer, it hardly mattered. To them, Texas meant punishment, a word whispered in fear during the final months of the war. Back home, propaganda had painted America as a brutal land. Every morning, that smell drifted from the camp kitchen, fresh loaves baked by American cooks. The women watched in disbelief as guards carried food to the mess hall, laughing, talking, tipping their hats to each other. No one shouted. No dogs barked. No orders barked in anger. The guards wore uniforms, yes, but under their caps were tanned faces that looked more like farmers than soldiers. A few even had spurs on their boots. "Cowboys," the women whispered. "Real cowboys." Among the prisoners was 23-year-old Lieselot Bauer from Munich. Before the war, she had worked for the Luftwaffe as a file clerk. Her father was a teacher. Her brother had died on the Eastern Front. She had believed everything the radio told her, that America was a greedy empire, a place without honor. Now, standing in the Texas heat, that story no longer made sense. The guards said please. They said thank you. It was confusing in a way that felt dangerous. The journey that brought her here had taken weeks. After her capture in Italy, she was loaded onto a ship across the Atlantic, a Liberty vessel built in an American factory. But crew had treated the prisoners better than she expected. They gave out blankets, bandaged wounds, even shared cigarettes on calm nights. One sailor had handed her a mug of coffee and said, "No sugar, but it'll keep you warm." She hadn't known how to answer. Now, in Texas, she stood on soil that seemed too wide to hate anyone for long. The camp commander, Major William R. Walker, ran things with quiet discipline. He quoted the Geneva Convention more than once a day and told his men, "If we treat them like beasts, we'll raise beasts. If we treat them like people, we'll raise people." The logic was practical. Calmer prisoners meant fewer guards, but the effect went deeper than he ever intended. The women were given clean uniforms, real beds, and 3 full meals a day. Some worked in sewing rooms, repairing U.S. uniforms. Others tended vegetable plots near the stables. They were even paid a few cents for their labor, money they could use at the camp canteen to buy soap, postcards, or Coca-Cola. At first, none of them believed it. They whispered that the food was a trick, that the kindness would vanish. But days passed and no cruelty came. The barbed wire was still there. Yet it no longer felt like the whole world. In her small notebook, Lissalot wrote, "We were told America was cruel. Instead, it is calm. Too calm. Maybe that's more dangerous." She didn't know that beyond those fences, the men guarding her had grown up herding cattle, not marching in ranks. Men who measured strength by fairness, not fear. Soon, those two worlds, the German prisoners and the Texas cowboys, would collide in a way no one could have predicted. And when it happened, the entire camp would stop breathing. At Camp Hearn, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost unreal. Each morning began with the clanging of a bell and the smell of coffee strong enough to wake the whole prairie. The German women lined up for roll call, their khaki uniforms clean but plain. By 7 o'clock, they were already working, some in the sewing rooms repairing uniforms, others outside tending vegetables under the watchful eyes of guards who leaned casually against fence posts. But those guards were not what the women had expected. Most weren't hardened soldiers. They were farmhands, cowboys, and mechanics pulled from small Texas towns. They wore sun-bleached shirts, spoke in soft drawls, and treated their duties more like ranch work than warfare. To them, these women weren't enemies. They were workers, people who needed to be managed, but not broken. The man who set that tone was Major William R. Walker, a career officer with the posture of a drill sergeant and the calm of a school teacher. He believed order didn't require cruelty. His rule was simple: follow the Geneva Convention to the letter. No shouting, no punishment without cause, no insults. If we treat them with dignity, he told his men, they'll return it. At first, the women didn't trust any of it. They'd been warned by Nazi officers that American kindness was only bait, that their captors would humiliate them when the cameras were gone. But no cameras came. The food stayed good. The guards stayed polite. Even the camp doctor, an army medic from Houston, treated them like patients, not prisoners. When the Red Cross visited Camp Hearn that autumn, their report stunned European officials. The women were healthy. They were allowed to write letters home. They received pay for their work. One official noted, "The camp operates more like a disciplined community than a prison." For the Texans, that wasn't strange. It was how they lived. The wide land didn't tolerate cruelty for long. It demanded cooperation. When equipment broke, everyone pitched in. When the weather turned, they looked out for each other. The same logic spread through the camp like sunlight. Lisa Lott noticed it most during her shifts near the stables. The air there smelled of hay and leather, not gun oil. The horses were kept in clean stalls, brushed daily by the same cowboys who guarded the camp gates. Sometimes they whistled as they worked, old frontier tunes that carried across the yard. It was the first music Lisa Lott had heard in months that didn't come from a marching band or a war film. One afternoon, while mending saddle straps, she began sketching. Her pencil moved quickly, capturing the curve of a horse's neck, the tension in its muscles, the tilt of its head. It was a habit she'd carried from home, drawing when words felt dangerous. She thought no one noticed until a shadow fell across her page. "Danke," she whispered automatically. He nodded, catching the meaning. "Means thank you, right?" She hesitated, then nodded. He pointed toward the open field beyond the barbed wire. "We run 'em after supper. You should watch sometime. They don't even know they're the lucky ones." Before she could reply, he tipped his hat and walked off. That night, the barracks buzzed with quiet whispers. The women asked what he had said, what he had wanted. Lisa Lott told them the truth, nothing more than a few words. But something about his tone, his calmness, stayed with her. The next evening, when the sun fell low and the sky turned orange, she stood by the fence. Beyond it, the cowboys rode their horses across the field, their silhouettes framed by dust and light. It looked nothing like war. For the first time since her capture, Lisa Lott felt something she couldn't name. Curiosity, maybe even peace. And somewhere between the sound of hooves and the smell of hay, she began to realize that this strange Texas camp was more than a prison. By autumn, the rhythm of Camp Hearn had become something almost peaceful. The war felt far away. The women worked, the guards rode patrol on horseback, and the Texas sun painted everything in shades of gold and dust. The fences still stood, but they no longer felt like walls. Every morning, Lisa Lott and a handful of others mended leather tack for the camp's horses. The guards often lingered nearby, offering quiet jokes or a cup of coffee. One of them, Tom Baker, the same man who had noticed her sketches, sometimes stopped to talk about ranch work, the weather, or his horse named Whiskey. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, his tone was steady and kind. To the women, it was strange. In Germany, soldiers shouted. Here, they asked questions. Tom once asked Lisa Lott, "You ever ride before?" She shook her head quickly. "Not really. Only saw soldiers' horses, not free ones." He nodded. "Well, there's a big difference. A free horse doesn't run because it's told to. It runs because it wants to." She didn't understand at first, but the idea stayed with her. Outside of work, the camp had its own small life. The Red Cross had donated books, and some of the prisoners started English lessons. Others grew vegetables or painted murals on the barracks walls. Guards would sometimes bring newspapers or radios, and at night, the sound of Glenn Miller or Texas swing drifted through the camp. The German women began humming along, their voices soft at first, then louder. For the Texans, it was equally strange. These weren't the cold, fanatical enemies they'd seen in propaganda posters. They were tired, homesick young women, most barely older than the guards themselves. "They work hard," one private wrote in a letter home, "and they're polite. You forget for a while that there's a war on." Lisa Lott kept drawing. Her sketches of horses, the camp, even the guards, began to spread quietly among both prisoners and soldiers. Some guards slipped her extra pencils. Others asked her to draw their horses. The walls of the workshop slowly filled with her art, simple, clear, alive. The barrier between captor and captive began to blur in small, almost invisible ways. Guards tipped their hats when passing. Prisoners waved back. One woman, a nurse from Cologne, began teaching a young soldier how to say German phrases for fun. Guten Morgen, he'd call out proudly each morning, earning laughter from the women. Major Walker noticed all of this and didn't stop it. He knew that morale mattered more than regulations. They're still prisoners, he told his officers, but that doesn't mean they have to feel like animals. Still, whispers spread. A few of the older guards disapproved. Too friendly, one said. War's not over yet. But most of the younger men shrugged it off. The Texans had their own logic. Decency wasn't weakness, it was habit. Sundays were the one day when the camp relaxed completely. Work paused, and men and women alike found small pockets of freedom. The guards held rodeos near the stables to pass the time. Friendly contests of skill and pride. The prisoners gathered at the fences to watch, cheering or laughing when a rider lost his seat. It was on one of those Sundays that something shifted forever. The air was hot and still, the crowd restless with anticipation. Tom Baker was preparing to ride his horse Whiskey, known for his stubborn streak. As he tightened the saddle straps, he glanced toward the fence and saw Lieselot watching with her sketchbook in hand. She smiled nervously, then looked away. When his turn came, Tom rode out into the corral, dust swirling around him. Whiskey bucked hard. The crowd whooped, and laughter echoed across the yard. For a few moments, the war didn't exist. It was just a cowboy and a horse under a Texas sky. When the ride ended, someone from the crowd shouted, "Let the German ladies have a try." Everyone laughed, but in that laughter was something dangerous and new, a test of the line that divided them. Tom looked toward Lieselot again. She froze, not sure whether to smile or run. Then he said quietly, "Ever wonder what it feels like to ride one?" The camp went silent. Even the horses stopped shifting. In the next few moments, what happened would challenge everything both sides thought they knew about enemies, mercy, and what freedom could look like behind a fence. The afternoon sun hung heavy over Camp Hearn, turning the dust into a glowing haze. A crowd of guards and prisoners lined the fence of the corral. Laughter had faded into silence. All eyes were fixed on one man and one woman. Tom Baker, the cowboy guard, and Lieselot Bauer, the German prisoner, who stood frozen a few steps from the gate. Tom's horse, Whiskey, pawed the ground, restless. The air crackled with uncertainty. No one knew what was about to happen, least of all Lieselot. Her heart raced as Tom opened the small gate and walked toward her. "You ever been on a horse?" he asked quietly, his drawl easy but serious. She shook her head, barely breathing. "Come on," he said. "He don't bite." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few guards exchanged worried looks. The camp's rules were clear. No unnecessary contact with prisoners. But no one moved to stop him. Maybe it was the heat, or the calm way he carried himself, or maybe everyone just wanted to see what would happen next. Tom extended his hand. For a moment, Lieselot didn't move. Then, almost without thinking, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle. In one smooth motion, he lifted her onto the saddle. The movement was so effortless, if for a second, she forgot to be afraid. And then, the world stopped. The corral went completely silent. The guards froze, the prisoners stared, and even the horses stood still. The Texas wind, always whispering through the grass, seemed to hold its breath. Lieselot sat stiffly, gripping the saddle horn, her eyes wide. She expected someone to shout, for the officer to storm in and drag her down. But nothing happened. Tom just smiled up at her. "Hold on tight," he said softly. "He's gentle once you get to know him." Whiskey took a slow step forward. Then another. The saddle creaked. The smell of leather and dust filled the air. The rhythm of the horse's gait was steady and calm, and for the first time in years, Lieselot felt a kind of movement that wasn't driven by orders or fear. She felt free. When they stopped, Tom looked up at her and said, "See? Told you he was kind." Her eyes welled up. She tried to speak, but no words came out. A single tear slipped down her cheek, leaving a clean trail through the dust on her face. Slowly, she climbed down. For a moment, their hands touched again. Tom tipped his hat. "Didn't mean no harm, ma'am. Just figured everyone deserves a little sunshine." The silence that followed was heavier than any speech. Behind the fence, a guard finally muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." But even he said it softly, as if afraid to break whatever spell had settled over the camp. Major Walker had been watching from his office porch. When his aide turned to ask if they should report the incident, Walker just exhaled and said, "So long as she didn't fall, I see no problem." Then he walked away. That night, Camp Hearn changed. Rumors spread through the barracks like wildfire. Some said it was a stunt, others called it madness, but most spoke of it as something sacred. "He lifted her like she mattered," one woman whispered, "like we weren't ghosts." The next morning, Tom was still there, drinking coffee, same hat, same easy grin. No one reprimanded him. No one dared. Something invisible had shifted, and everyone felt it. The prisoners worked with a new quiet energy that day. They stood a little taller. The guards were gentler, more thoughtful. It wasn't about the ride itself, it was about what it proved. That kindness once shown couldn't be undone. In her diary that night, Lieselot wrote, "For 10 seconds, I stopped being a prisoner. I was just a woman on a horse, and the world felt wide again." Across the camp, the chaplain wrote something similar in his logbook. A cowboy lifted an enemy onto his horse, and for a moment, the war stopped. Neither of them knew it yet, but that single act, simple, wordless, human, would outlive the war, the fences, and even the people who witnessed it. Because that afternoon, under the Texas sun, mercy had proved itself stronger than victory. Winter came soft and dry that year. The Texas sky turned pale, and frost clung to the fence lines around Camp Hearn. The war was still raging overseas, but inside the camp, it felt distant, like thunder from another world. The prisoners worked less now. Some read, some wrote letters, and every evening, Lieselot sat near the stables, sketching the horses she had learned to love. After that day in the corral, things inside the camp changed quietly, but completely. The guards still did their rounds, the prisoners still lined up for roll call, but the edge of fear was gone. The women smiled when the cowboys passed by. The men smiled back. Even the most hardened guard couldn't deny that something had softened. The story of the ride spread far beyond the fences. The Red Cross inspector mentioned it in his next report, a remarkable display of mutual respect. In nearby towns, locals repeated it in cafes and churches. "Did you hear about the cowboy who put a German woman on his horse?" Nobody knew the names, but the story traveled fast. In a time of violence, it sounded like a miracle. For Lieselot, it was more than a story. It was proof that kindness could exist in the middle of war. She began teaching English to the other women, sketching portraits for guards, and writing long letters home. In one letter, she told her mother, "They do not treat us like prisoners. They treat us like people who lost their way." Tom Baker never spoke much about that day. When asked, he would shrug and say, "Didn't seem right, keeping someone scared of sunlight." But people noticed he was different too. He still rode whiskey in the evenings, but now he often paused near the women's barracks, tipping his hat before riding off. Then, one May morning in 1945, the radio crackled in the mess hall. Everyone, guards and prisoners alike, crowded around as a calm American voice announced, "Germany has surrendered unconditionally." No one cheered. No one moved. The words hung in the air like dust in sunlight. Lizelot felt her knees weaken. Some women cried. Others stood in silence, staring at the floor. The guards removed their hats. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of the radio. Later that day, the kitchen served extra food: biscuits, eggs, bacon, even Coca-Cola chilled in metal tubs. The guards and prisoners ate together for the first time. No ranks, no orders, just people sitting side by side. Tom brought Lizelot a plate. "Peace breakfast," he said simply. She smiled through tears. "It tastes like forgiveness." Someone turned on a radio, and Glenn Miller's "In the Mood" drifted through the mess hall. A few women hummed softly, and one guard joined in. The sound of laughter returned, quiet, cautious, real. That night, Lizelot wrote in her diary, "We thought defeat would taste like humiliation. Instead, it tastes like bacon and coffee." Weeks later, the trucks arrived to take the prisoners east toward the ship's home. Each woman carried a small suitcase and one personal item. Lizelot held Tom's old cowboy hat, the brim still faintly smelling of dust and smoke. At the gate, Tom waited, hatless for the first time. "Guess this is goodbye," he said. "For now," she answered. "You taught me more than English, Tom. You taught me what freedom feels like." He smiled, embarrassed. Never thought a cowboy would teach a German about freedom. The trucks started their engines. Lizelot climbed aboard and waved until the camp disappeared behind a haze of dust and sunlight. Months later, she returned to a ruined Germany. Her home was gone, her family scattered. But in the middle of that wreckage, she carried something the war couldn't destroy: a small piece of Texas. Years later, a letter arrived at Tom Baker's ranch. It came from Bremen, written in careful English. Inside was a photograph of a woman standing beside a rebuilt farmhouse, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. On the back were 4 words: "Still riding, still free." Tom never wrote back. He didn't need to. He framed the photo and hung it above his desk, where it stayed for the rest of his life. Beneath it, in his own rough handwriting, he wrote, "The day we stopped being enemies." And that's how the war ended for them. Not with victory, not with surrender, but with a horse, a smile, and a moment when the world remembered what being human really meant. Texas, December 1944. The sun was just beginning to rise over the flat plains, turning the sky a soft orange. Inside a wooden mess hall, surrounded by barbed wire, a sound cut through the morning stillness. The crackle of bacon hitting a hot griddle. The smell rolled through the camp like a wave. Even the guards stopped talking. The German prisoners, lined up in their worn field jackets, looked at each other in disbelief. Bacon? For them? It had to be a mistake. They shuffled forward slowly, boots scraping against the wooden floor. A big man behind the counter flipped eggs with one hand and greeted each prisoner the same way. "Morning, partner." His accent was thick, southern, and friendly. For months, these men had been fed lies about what captivity in America would be like. Nazi propaganda warned that the U.S. would starve or torture its prisoners. Now, the first thing they saw was an American cook in a sweat-stained cowboy hat humming a country tune while serving them breakfast. One young prisoner, Carl Weiss, a mechanic from Dresden, froze when he saw the plate handed to him. Scrambled eggs, toast, and 2 golden slices of bacon still sizzling. He stared at it as if it were an illusion. He hadn't tasted pork in almost 2 years. "Go on, son," the cook said, smiling. "Ain't no poison in it." Carl sat down at a long table, surrounded by men just as stunned as he was. He took a bite. The crunch, the salt, the warmth, it hit him harder than hunger ever had. For months, he had lived like a shadow, surviving on thin soup and black bread. Now, a single piece of bacon was undoing everything he thought he knew about his enemy. Around him, no one spoke. Some chewed slowly, some stared at their plates, others wiped their eyes. Across the room, the cook winked, as if he understood exactly what was happening. Carl remembered the posters back home, the Americans painted as fat, greedy monsters. Yet here they were, feeding their prisoners like guests. He looked at the guards leaning against the wall, relaxed, chatting quietly. None of them looked like monsters. They looked like ranchers, farmers, neighbors. Outside, a horse neighed somewhere beyond the fence. A flag flapped lazily in the wind. For the first time, Carl noticed how peaceful everything sounded. No bombs, no shouting, no engines. Just bacon sizzling and men eating in silence. In that moment, something began to shift inside him. America didn't fight this war with hatred. It fought it with decency, with order, with a strange and quiet confidence that didn't need to prove itself. When breakfast ended, Carl lingered for a moment, staring at the empty plate. He didn't yet know it, but that morning's meal, the simplest act of kindness in the middle of a global war, would change him more than any battlefield ever had. Outside, the Texas sun climbed higher. The camp gates opened for the day's work detail, and as Carl stepped into the light, he realized this was not the America he had been warned about. This was something far more dangerous to the Reich, an enemy that won not through cruelty, but through humanity. Only a few months before that Texas morning, Carl Weiss had been a soldier on the run. His panzer unit had fallen apart in France after the Allied invasion. Surrounded, starving, and half-mad from exhaustion, he and hundreds of others finally surrendered near St. Lo. They expected death, or worse. The German army had told them that capture by Americans meant torture or lifelong slavery. Instead, the Americans gave them water, canned meat, and cigarettes. One soldier even offered Carl a chocolate bar. He couldn't make sense of it. Was this some kind of trick? A week later, Carl and thousands of other prisoners were herded onto Liberty ships bound for the United States. The ships were massive, noisy, oily, and packed with men who could barely imagine where they were going. For days, they crossed the Atlantic in silence, the smell of salt and diesel mixing in the air. Guards watched them, but not harshly. They shared the same weather, the same cramped deck. When the New York skyline finally came into view, the prisoners pressed against the rails. What they saw silenced them. The city rose like something from another planet, bright, untouched, alive. No ruins, no bombed-out buildings, no starving faces. For men who came from a Germany reduced to ashes, it was a shock. At the docks, nurses handed out coffee and blankets. The guards said please and thank you. It was so absurd that Carl almost laughed. These people were supposed to be the enemy. The prisoners boarded trains, headed south and west. For days, they crossed a continent that seemed endless. Through the windows, they saw forests, rivers, fields, and small towns that all looked whole. Children waved from porches. Farmers loaded hay. Soldiers at stations smiled instead of shouting. By the time the train reached Texas, the landscape had changed completely. The air shimmered with heat, and the plains stretched forever. Somewhere out there, the men were told, they would be working on ranches, in cotton fields, and even on military farms. The camp that became Carl's new home was simple but clean. Whitewashed barracks, open yards, a mess hall that smelled faintly of coffee and soap. No one was beaten, no one was chained. Every man received a bunk, a bar of soap, and 3 full meals a day. It wasn't generosity, it was policy. Under the Geneva Convention, America had chosen to treat its prisoners well, believing that decency kept order better than cruelty. It worked. Healthy men caused fewer problems. They also became witnesses, living proof of how differently the U.S. fought its wars. At night, Carl could hear swing music drifting through the camp loudspeakers. Music the Nazis had banned. The rhythm was strange and alive. He didn't understand the lyrics, but he liked the sound. It made the night feel human again. One evening, an older prisoner whispered, "If this is captivity, what do we call what we left behind?" Carl didn't answer, but he knew the man was right. America was showing them something their own country had forgotten. Discipline without fear, strength without cruelty, and power that came not from domination, but from abundance. When the lights went out, Carl lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The hum of generators outside was steady, organized, and unstoppable. In his mind, he compared it to the chaos of Germany's final days, the hunger, the ruin, broken trains. For the first time, he began to understand why his country was losing. It wasn't because America had more weapons. It was because America had more faith in work, in order, and in people. The next morning, the guards called for the work detail. Carl stepped into the sun, the Texas sky so wide it seemed to swallow him whole. Somewhere out there, beyond the fences, he would soon meet the cowboys who would change the rest of his life. When the trucks rolled out of the camp and rumbled down a dirt road toward a nearby ranch, Carl Weiss didn't know what to expect. The guards had said they'd be helping out local farmers, but that could mean anything. As the trucks stopped and the dust settled, the men saw not fences or guard towers, but wide, open land. The Texas sky stretched endlessly in every direction. Horses grazed in the distance. Windmills turned lazily above the mesquite trees. It didn't look like a prison, it looked like freedom. A tall man in a straw hat waited by the gate, a grin on his face. "Mornin', boys," he said, his accent thick and warm. "Name's Jack Dempsey. No, not the boxer," he added with a wink. "You work hard, you eat well. That's the deal." The prisoners looked at one another, unsure if he was serious. But he was. Jack Dempsey wasn't a soldier. He was a rancher. And like many Texans during the war, he needed help. With so many young men overseas, there weren't enough hands to run the farms. The prisoners would fill the gap. At first, everything felt surreal. German soldiers, men who had once followed Hitler's banners, were now feeding cattle and fixing fences in the heart of America. Carl struggled to make sense of it. The work was hard and hot, but the cowboys treated them like workers, not enemies. They joked, swore, and offered tips on how to handle a stubborn horse or lift a hay bale without tearing your back out. During lunch, Jack's wife brought out sandwiches and coffee in tin mugs. Once, she even handed out bottles of Coca-Cola. The glass sweated in the heat. Carl took a sip and froze. The taste was sweet, fizzy, almost electric. "You like it?" Jack laughed. The days settled into a rhythm. Work at sunrise, meals at noon, music in the evening. The guards barely had to watch them. There was nowhere to run, and no one wanted to. Out here, the only walls were the horizon and the heat. Over time, the cowboys and prisoners began to talk. Not much at first, just gestures and broken English. But it was enough. They compared weather, families, and the way they tied rope. The cowboys teased them about their German accents. The prisoners joked about American coffee being too strong. Slowly, laughter replaced suspicion. One afternoon, a young ranch hand named Tom handed Carl a set of reins. "Ever ride one of these?" he asked, nodding toward a restless brown mare. Carl shook his head. Tom grinned. "Well, today's the day." The first few seconds were chaos. The horse jerked, Carl wobbled, the cowboys laughed. But Tom steadied him. "Don't fight her," he said. "Trust her." Carl did, and for the first time since capture, he felt the rush of motion, wind, and control. It was a strange kind of freedom, even if borrowed. That night, the prisoners returned to camp covered in dust, but lighter in spirit. The guards didn't have to bark orders anymore. The men worked hard, and they did it willingly. It wasn't obedience, it was pride. One German prisoner wrote later, "They made us feel useful again. In that, there was mercy." By September, the ranch hands began calling them the German cowboys. The nickname stuck. Locals would even wave as the trucks passed by. Some brought them food or cigarettes. What had begun as a forced labor detail had turned into something neither side expected: mutual respect. Carl often thought about it at night. Back home, strength had always meant fear, obey or suffer. Here, strafe looked different. It looked like patience, humor, and trust. As the Texas fall rolled in, the mornings grew cooler. Carl found himself looking forward to each day. The smell of hay, the laughter, the small moments of normal life. He no longer felt like a prisoner. He felt like a man rebuilding himself, one sunrise at a time. But soon, something as simple as breakfast would remind him just how powerful kindness could be. By January 1945, the Texas winter had turned the mornings crisp and quiet. The war in Europe was nearing its end, though no one in the camp knew exactly how close. The prisoners still woke before dawn, lined up for roll call, and marched to breakfast just as they always did. But that morning was different. The air carried a smell no one had sensed in months. Rich, smoky, warm. Bacon. Not the thin scraps sometimes added to the stew, but real, thick-cut bacon frying on the griddle, the kind they remembered from childhood breakfasts before the war. The men slowed their steps as they entered the mess hall. The sound of sizzling fat filled the room, and steam fogged the windows. The American cook, a big man with a mustache and a cowboy hat tilted low, flipped slices onto metal trays, humming softly to himself. "Morning, Fritz," he said cheerfully as Carl Weiss stepped up in line. "Guess it's about time y'all had a real breakfast again." Carl tried to answer but couldn't. He just nodded and accepted the plate. Eggs, bread, and 3 perfect strips of bacon. Around him, the other prisoners stared at their plates in silence, as if afraid it might disappear. At first, no one touched the food. It didn't seem possible that their captors would give them something so simple, so good. Then, slowly, one man took a bite, and the sound of chewing filled the hall. Carl lifted a piece to his mouth. The flavor hit him all at once, salty, crisp, real. His eyes burned. He thought of his mother back home in Dresden, of the empty shelves, of letters that never arrived. For a moment, he wasn't a soldier or a prisoner. He was just a man tasting life again. Across the room, a few men began to cry quietly. Others laughed in disbelief. One whispered, "This is propaganda." But Carl knew it wasn't. It was kindness, and that was something no regime could fake. The guards sat at nearby tables, eating the same breakfast. There were no speeches, no ceremony, just men sharing a meal. A few talked about baseball or the weather. One showed a photo of his wife to a German sergeant, who responded by pulling a small creased photo of his own family from his pocket. The two smiled awkwardly. When breakfast ended, no one moved to leave. The moment hung in the air, simple, human, and impossible to explain. Later that day, while working on the ranch, Carl told Tom, the young cowboy who'd taught him to ride, about the breakfast. "Back home, they told us you were monsters," Carl said. Tom shrugged and spat into the dirt. "You heard wrong, partner. We just work hard and like our bacon." Carl laughed. The sentence was so ordinary, so absurd, that it broke through years of fear and propaganda. That night in his bunk, he wrote in his small diary, "This morning, I ate bacon and saw America. They don't conquer with guns. They conquer with breakfast." It was half a joke, half a confession. But deep down, Carl knew it was true. In the months that followed, the world outside the fences began to crumble. News of Germany's defeats drifted through the camp in whispers. When word finally came that Berlin had fallen, the mess hall fell silent. No one cheered. No one spoke. The next morning, they were served bacon again. Not as a celebration, not as a taunt, but as a gesture. The cook said nothing as he served it, and neither did the men. But every bite carried a message stronger than any speech. The war might have ended, but humanity had survived. Carl never forgot that morning. Years later, when people asked him when he stopped believing in the Reich, he never mentioned battles or speeches. He just smiled and said Texas, 1945. The smell of bacon. By the spring of 1945, Texas was warming again. Wildflowers dotted the plains, and the air smelled faintly of rain and dust. Inside the camp, life had slowed to a quiet rhythm. Breakfast, work, letters, waiting. But beneath that calm was a tension everyone could feel. The guards said little. The prisoners spoke less. They all knew something was ending. One April evening, as the men sat eating supper, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. A voice read news from overseas. The next morning, the guards lined the men up and read an announcement. The war in Europe was over. "You are no longer enemies," one officer said. "You are guests until arrangements are made." It sounded impossible. The men didn't cheer. They just stood there, stunned. Then came the smell. Bacon again, that same familiar smell that had marked every turning point of their time in Texas. The cook, sleeves rolled up, flipped slices onto every plate. Guards and prisoners ate together, quietly, like neighbors after a storm. There were no fences in that moment, no uniforms, no sides. Just men who had survived something too big to name. That afternoon, a Red Cross truck arrived with mail. For many, it was the first letter from home in almost a year. The men gathered under the shade of the mess hall porch, holding thin envelopes like treasures. Carl's letter was from his mother. The paper was fragile, the handwriting uneven. "My dear Carl," it began, "we are alive. Dresden is gone, but we are safe. The Americans brought food. Imagine that. They fed us. The world has turned upside down." Carl folded the letter carefully, his hands trembling. Around him, other men wept or sat silently staring at their mail. For the first time since capture, the tears weren't for fear or loss. They were for relief. That evening, the camp chaplain, an American sergeant turned preacher, offered to hold a short service. The guards stood side by side with the prisoners, singing softly under the open Texas sky. The words didn't matter. What mattered was that they sang together. A few weeks later, the men learned they would be sent home. Before they left, the guards announced a farewell breakfast. When Carl entered the mess hall that morning, the tables were covered in checkered cloths. On each plate, eggs, biscuits, and bacon. The cook raised his mug and said, "You boys worked hard. Let's eat like free men today. Not guards and prisoners, just folks." For a moment, the room was quiet. Then, someone started clapping. Another joined in. Soon the hall was filled with applause and laughter. As the men ate, a radio played softly in the background. "Don't fence me in." Some of the Germans hummed along, their accents heavy but genuine. A few guards even joined them. When the song ended, the cook poured Carl a cup of real coffee. "This one's from my wife's kitchen," he said. Carl smiled. "Tell her she makes peace better than generals." That night, Carl wrote his final letter home. America was not what we were told. They didn't defeat us with hate. They defeated us with generosity. Days later, as the trucks carried them to the train station, the prisoners waved goodbye. The guards tipped their hats. Carl took one last look at the camp, then reached into his pocket and felt a small strip of red and white cloth the cook had given him from a table cover. "Something to remember Texas by," the man had said. Years later, long after he returned home, Carl kept that cloth folded in a drawer. Whenever someone asked what changed him, he didn't talk about tanks or battles. He just smiled and said, "Bacon, Texas, and the men who taught me what freedom really means." Texas, 1944. The sky above Camp Hearn stretched wider than most people could imagine. A blue so bright, it looked endless. The heat rolled across the fields, turning the air into something heavy you could almost see. Inside the wire fences, a group of German women worked quietly near the stables, sewing, mending, trying not to meet the eyes of the guards who passed on horseback. For most of them, it was still hard to believe they were alive. Months earlier, they'd been captured in Italy. Clerks, nurses, and radio operators in the Luftwaffe support units. They had been told they'd never survive capture, that Americans hated them, that women prisoners were treated like animals. Yet here they were, in the middle of Texas, under a sun so strong it bleached every memory of Europe. That afternoon started like any other: dust, sweat, and silence. Then the sound of hooves broke through the still air. 3 cowboys, guards technically, but dressed like they'd ridden straight out of a western, rode into the yard. Their horses kicked up red dirt that hung in the sunlight like smoke. One of them, tall and sunburned, with a Stetson pushed back on his head, swung down from his saddle and tied his horse to the fence. His name was Tom Baker, a ranch hand from Llano County before the Army drafted him. To the prisoners, he looked like every American movie poster they'd been taught to fear. Broad shoulders, sharp jaw, confident in a way that didn't need words. Among the women standing by the fence was 23-year-old Lieselotte Bauer from Munich. She was small, fair-haired, and carried herself like someone still trying to disappear. When Tom's eyes found hers, she looked away. He started walking toward her anyway. No one spoke. Even the guards went still, unsure what was happening. Tom stopped a few feet from her and asked, "You ever been on a horse before?" The question made no sense. She froze. "9, she whispered. Tom smiled slightly, not mocking, just calm. And before anyone could object, he reached out, placed his hands gently around her waist, and lifted her onto his horse as easily as if she weighed nothing. The camp stopped breathing. The other prisoners gasped. The horse shifted under her, muscles alive beneath the saddle. Lieselotte's hands gripped the horn tight. She waited for someone to shout, for the blow that never came. Tom stepped back, looking up at her. "Hold on tight," he said quietly. "He won't bite." Then he led the horse in a slow circle inside the corral. The leather creaked. Dust shimmered around them. For the first time since capture, Lieselotte felt something she didn't have a name for: movement without fear, freedom disguised as a ride. When the horse stopped, Tom looked up at her again. "You're fine now," he said, tipping his hat. She nodded, eyes wet, unable to speak. Around them, the camp was silent. The guards didn't move. The prisoners didn't breathe. For 10 seconds, everything that made them enemies disappeared. No one knew what to do with that silence. The war was still raging half a world away. But here, under a blinding Texas sun, it suddenly felt distant, small, almost fragile. That moment would ripple far beyond the fence, retold for decades as the day the war paused for a heartbeat. But to understand how a cowboy's simple act could break through years of hatred, you have to go back to the journey that brought a German woman across an ocean, straight into the heart of Texas. Before that day in Texas, Liselott Bauer had already survived a lifetime of chaos. She had been a clerk in a Luftwaffe supply unit stationed in northern Italy, one of the last places still holding out as the Allies closed in. When the front finally collapsed, her unit scattered. Trucks rumbled through bombed-out towns, engines coughing, drivers shouting. Dust, fire, and fear mixed into one endless blur. On a cold night near Naples, Liselott's truck broke down. The next morning, American soldiers surrounded the convoy. She expected shouting, punishment, maybe worse. Instead, one soldier lowered his rifle and offered her a canteen. "Drink," he said. She hesitated, then drank. It was the first time in months she'd tasted clean water. That small gesture confused her more than any propaganda ever had. Back home, German radio warned that Americans were brutal, that captured women were paraded through streets or left to starve. But these men treated her and the others like people. Watchful, yes, but not cruel. Days later, they were loaded onto a ship bound for the United States. It was a Liberty transport, one of hundreds that carried Axis prisoners across the Atlantic. The journey took weeks. When the ship reached the Gulf of Mexico, the prisoners were herded onto trains. The windows were covered, but through the cracks, Liselott caught glimpses of the country that would rewrite everything she knew. The land rolled by in endless color. Green fields, white houses, small towns untouched by war. Children waved from porches. No ruins, no hunger, no fear. As the train headed inland, the scenery changed. The trees thinned, replaced by wide, open plains that stretched forever. Cattle dotted the fields like moving shadows. Signs flashed by: Waco, Brenham, Hearn. Then the train slowed to a stop beside a cluster of wooden buildings behind a high fence. A sign read, "Camp Hearn, Texas." The air outside was thick with heat and the smell of hay. The bards weren't wearing helmets or shouting orders. They wore cowboy hats. One of them even tipped his hat and said, "Welcome to Texas, ladies." Liselott thought it must be a cruel joke, but it wasn't. Camp Hearn was one of more than 500 prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United States, a network that held almost 500,000 Axis soldiers. Texas alone housed over 70,000 of them. Some built roads, some picked cotton, some repaired uniforms for the U.S. Army. The American War Department insisted on following the Geneva Convention to the letter. Prisoners received 3 full meals a day, medical care, and even small wages for their work, about 80 cents a day in camp currency. They could buy cigarettes, postcards, candy, even Coca-Cola at the canteen. To Liselott and the others, it felt surreal. Back in Germany, families were starving. Cities burned night after night. Here, even prisoners were given bread and milk. If this is captivity, one woman whispered, what do they call freedom? Liselott didn't answer. She only knew that this place, this strange, sun-baked land of fences and manners, scared her more than any battlefield ever had. Because if the enemy wasn't what she'd been taught to hate, then everything she believed might be wrong. That night, as she lay in her bunk, listening to the crickets and distant laughter of the guards outside, she realized something unsettling. The war was still raging across the ocean, but here in Texas, another kind of battle had begun. One fought not with bullets, but with kindness. Camp Hearn didn't look like the prisons Lieselot had imagined. From a distance, it could have been mistaken for a small ranch town. Long rows of whitewashed barracks, a mess hall that smelled of bread and coffee, and pastures where horses grazed behind barbed wire fences. Every morning began the same way: a bell at sunrise, breakfast, roll call, then work. But the tone was different. The guards didn't shout. They said please. They said thank you. It felt wrong, and that was what made it so unsettling. The camp commander, Major William R. Walker, ran Camp Hearn with an odd mix of military precision and quiet empathy. He'd served in France during the First World War and had learned one thing: hatred was expensive. Discipline was cheaper. His orders were clear: no abuse, no humiliation, no unnecessary punishment. If we treat them like animals, he told his men, we'll raise animals. But if we treat them like people, they'll start acting human again. Done. Most of his guards weren't soldiers by nature. They were ranchers, mechanics, and farmhands who traded their saddles for uniforms. Some had never left Texas before the war. They still rode horses to patrol the fence lines and spoke with the lazy rhythm of men who'd grown up under big skies. At first, the German women kept to themselves. They worked long hours in the sewing unit, repairing uniforms for soldiers still fighting overseas. They spoke little, moved quietly, and jumped whenever a guard passed too close. The Americans noticed. They look more scared than dangerous, one guard said. The turning point came one hot afternoon when Tom Baker, the same young cowboy who'd later lift Lieselot onto his horse, was repairing a fence near the women's quarters. He spotted her sitting in the shade, hunched over a piece of cardboard. Curious, he walked closer. On it, she had drawn a horse. Powerful, mid-gallop, muscles tense, mane flowing. It was perfect. Tom whistled softly. "That's real good, miss." Lieselot startled, her pencil snapping in her hand. She looked up, unsure if he was mocking her. "Danke," she said cautiously. He nodded. "That means thank you, right?" She hesitated, then nodded back. Tom crouched beside the fence, pointing toward the pasture. "You ever seen one run out there? The horses, I mean." "Only in books," she said quietly. He smiled. "You should watch sometime. They don't even know they're lucky." Then he tipped his hat and went back to work. That short, harmless exchange became a whisper in the camp that night. The women repeated it among themselves. "He spoke to her," one said in disbelief, and she answered. It was nothing, just a few words. But in a place built on silence, it was like a door opening. Over the following weeks, the air in Camp Hearn began to change. The guards started tipping their hats when they passed groups of prisoners. The women began to greet them back. Someone slipped an apple through the fence. Someone else left a folded newspaper. The women, in return, stitched handkerchiefs and gave them as small thank yous. At night, the camp loudspeakers played swing music. The Germans called it enemy jazz, but secretly, they listened. Some even hummed along. The guards noticed and started whistling the same tunes. Bit by bit, the space between them grew smaller. Major Walker wrote in his report that month, "Morale improving steadily. No incidents. Prisoners adjusting well." He didn't have the part that truly mattered. That his camp was becoming something rare. A place where war's hatred. One evening, when the sun was bleeding out over the fields, Tom saw Liselot again near the fence. She was watching the horses this time, sketchbook in hand. He nodded to her and called, "Told you, they run like they don't have a care in the world." She smiled, not the quick, cautious kind, but a real one. "They look free," she said. "Yeah," Tom replied, glancing toward the horizon. "That's Texas for you." Neither of them realized it then, but that quiet friendship, a cowboy and a German prisoner separated by wire, was about to lead to the moment that would stop an entire camp in its tracks. By midsummer, the Texas sun turned everything it touched to golden dust. Work started early and ended before the heat grew unbearable. Sundays were the only real break, when the guards let the horses run in the corral and sometimes held small rodeos to pass the time. The prisoners watched from behind the fence, curious, half smiling despite themselves. On one of those Sundays, Tom Baker was among the riders. His horse, a stubborn bay named Whiskey, snorted and pawed at the ground as if it already knew what was coming. The guards gathered near the fence. A few of the women stood in the shade, shielding their eyes. Liselot Bauer was there too, sketchbook in hand, quietly tracing the shapes of the horses as they moved. When Tom mounted up, the horse kicked hard, almost unseating him. The crowd laughed, cheering him on as he held tight. Dust exploded under the hooves. It was the kind of spectacle that broke the monotony of war. Just a cowboy fighting gravity and pride. After a minute, Tom slowed the horse and brought him to a stop, sweat dripping from his face. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Let the German ladies try next." Laughter rippled through the camp. It was a harmless joke, but it cut through the air like a challenge. Tom looked toward the fence, saw Liselot standing there with her sketchbook, and without thinking, called out, "You ever been on a horse before?" She froze. "9," she said softly, shaking her head. He smiled. "Well, there's a first time for everything." The laughter stopped. A few guards exchanged uneasy looks. The camp captain stepped out of his office, shading his eyes with one hand. Everyone knew the rules, no unnecessary contact with prisoners. But Tom was already walking toward the fence. He opened the small gate and held out his hand. "Come on," he said gently. "He don't bite." Liselot hesitated, glancing at the other women. No one spoke. Then, almost without realizing it, she stepped forward. Tom's hand was warm and calloused from work. In one smooth motion, he lifted her onto the saddle. For a moment, no one moved. The camp went silent. Even the cicadas, constant and loud all summer, seemed to stop. Liselot sat stiff in the saddle, both hands gripping the leather horn. She waited for someone to yell, for punishment, for the illusion to end. But none of that happened. Tom placed a steadying hand on the reins and said quietly, "Just breathe. You're safe." The horse shifted, then began a slow walk around the corral. The sound of hooves echoed softly against the fence. The smell of dust, leather, and sunlight filled the air. For the first time in years, Liselot felt motion that wasn't forced, movement that belonged to her. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from something she couldn't name. When the horse stopped, she looked down at Tom. He tipped his hat. "See? Not so bad." Her eyes shimmered. A single tear slipped down her cheek, leaving a clean line through the dust. Tom helped her down, his hands careful, respectful. Around them, no one dared speak. The captain watched from across the yard, exhaled, and muttered, "So long as she didn't fall." Then he turned and walked away. The silence that followed felt sacred. 10 seconds of freedom. No sides, no ranks, no war. Just a woman on a horse and a cowboy who didn't see an enemy, only a person. That night, Lieselot wrote in her diary, "The moment he lifted me, I stopped being a prisoner. For 10 seconds, I was free." The next morning, whispers ran through the camp. Some said Tom would be punished. Others thought it was propaganda. But nothing happened. He showed up for duty as usual, calm, coffee in hand. The war went on, but something inside Camp Hearn had changed. The women began to stand taller. The guards smiled more. For the first time, there was laughter across the fence. And from that day forward, no one in the camp could quite explain it. But the place felt lighter, as if kindness itself had bent the rules of war. By the spring of 1945, the war was collapsing overseas, but Camp Hearn kept its quiet rhythm. The guards still rode the fence lines each morning. The German women still worked in the sewing shed, stitching patches and repairing uniforms. But everyone felt it. The end was coming. The air itself seemed to hum with waiting. Letters began to arrive more often, carried by the Red Cross. Some women learned that their towns were gone. Others that their families had survived. One morning, Lieselot received a letter written in trembling handwriting. "We are alive. Dresden is gone, but we are safe. The Americans brought food." She read it twice, her hands shaking. For months, she had seen kindness in Texas. Now she knew it existed back home, too. When the news finally came, Germany's surrender, it didn't sound like victory. The announcement crackled through a radio speaker in the mess hall. Germany has surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The words hung in the air like dust. The German women stood frozen. Some cried, some stared at the ground. The guards removed their hats. No one cheered. For the first time, there were no sides left. Just people who had survived something too big to understand. That afternoon, the camp did something simple but unforgettable. The cooks brought out fresh biscuits, real coffee, and, because it was Texas, bacon. The smell drifted through the camp, wrapping around everyone like a memory. Someone found a radio station playing Glenn Miller's "In the Mood." The music carried across the yard, soft and slow. Tom Baker filled 2 plates and walked toward the sewing shed. Lieselot was sitting alone, staring at the fence line. He offered her a plate. "Breakfast," he said. She looked up, half smiling. "For peace?" "For peace," he answered. She took a bite of the biscuit and laughed through her tears. "Strange," she said softly. "I thought defeat would taste bitter." "Guess you were wrong," Tom said. That night, the camp was quiet. Some of the women hummed German lullabies. Over the next weeks, the prisoners prepared to leave. Trucks came and went, loaded with crates and luggage. Major Walker walked the grounds with a clipboard, saying less than usual. When the day arrived for the women to depart, the guards lined up by the gates. There were no speeches, just nods, handshakes, and the kind of silence that said everything words couldn't. When Lieselot stepped forward, she saw Tom waiting. He looked awkward in his pressed uniform. His hat held against his chest. "Guess this is goodbye," he said. "For now," she answered. She reached out and took his hand. "You taught me how to ride again, not just the horse." He smiled, embarrassed. "Well, don't forget Texas." "I won't," she said. Then he handed her his hat. "Keep it, so you remember." She pressed it to her chest. "I will." The truck rumbled to life. As it pulled away, she turned back and waved. Tom lifted his arm in a small salute. Dust swallowed the road until the truck was gone. Years later, in post-war Germany, Lieselot built a new life. She taught English to school children and told them stories, not about battles, but about the people who showed her humanity when the world had none left. Her diary from those years survives in a museum today. On one page, she wrote, "They beat us with no whips, conquered us without chains. I saw America, not through its bombs, but through a cowboy's eyes." In Texas, Camp Hearn was dismantled by 1946. The barracks were sold off as lumber. The fences rusted away. Only the corral remained, its posts silvered by sun and wind. Tom Baker went back to ranching, raised a family, and didn't talk much about the war. But he kept one photograph framed above his desk, a woman standing in front of a rebuilt farmhouse, wearing a hat that looked suspiciously Texan. On the back, written in careful English, were 4 words: "Still riding. Still free." Com never wrote back. He didn't have to. Underneath the photo, in his own handwriting, were 6 simple words: "The day we stopped being enemies." Because sometimes history doesn't end with victory, it ends with mercy. And in a dusty Texas camp, mercy won. A fascist and a communist signing a peace pact. It sounded impossible, almost absurd. But in the summer of 1939, that's exactly what happened. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, 2 men who despised everything about each other, shook hands through their ministers and sealed one of the strangest deals in modern history: the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. To the rest of the world, it looked like a diplomatic stunt. But hidden inside that document were secret maps dividing Eastern Europe like pieces on a chessboard. Poland, the Baltic states, even parts of Finland, all quietly marked for conquest. On paper, it was a promise of peace. In reality, it was a countdown to global war. Hitler never wanted peace. What he wanted was time. He knew Germany wasn't ready to fight on 2 fronts. Not yet. Since the 1920s, he had written about his hatred for communism and his dream of conquering the living space of the East. But to do that, he first needed to make sure the Soviets would stand aside while he destroyed Poland and crushed Western Europe. A week after signing the pact, the plan began. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, German tanks crossed into Poland. The sky filled with the roar of dive bombers. Cities burned. Within days, the world that had been holding its breath finally exploded. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. For a moment, it seemed as if Hitler's gamble had paid off. The Soviet Union stayed silent, watching from the east. Germany invaded without fear of a second front. His armies swept through Poland, Denmark, Norway, and finally France in just 6 weeks. The world watched in disbelief as Paris fell and swastikas fluttered over the Eiffel Tower. It looked like the dawn of a new empire. But history has a cruel sense of timing. The pact that gave Hitler his confidence would also seal his fate, because the friendship between Berlin and Moscow was never meant to last. Both dictators saw it as temporary, a trick to gain time, and when that fragile deal finally shattered, it would drag the entire world into the deadliest conflict in human history. Hitler believed he was unstoppable. The generals obeyed, the crowds cheered, and the map of Europe turned black under the banners of the Reich. Yet beneath the victories, the seeds of disaster were already growing. His empire stood on arrogance, deception, and a lie he had told himself, that he could outsmart everyone, even fate itself. The storm was only beginning, and the man who dreamed of conquering the world was about to meet the one force he could never defeat: his own pride. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the eastern sky lit up with fire. More than 3.5 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. They called it Operation Barbarossa. Hitler believed it would take only a few months. After all, France had fallen in 6 weeks. Why would Russia be any different? The Blitzkrieg roared forward like a machine built from thunder. Tanks rolled across endless fields. Dive bombers screamed above, and cities like Minsk and Kiev vanished under waves of steel and flame. In the first weeks, it looked like another miracle of German speed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured. Entire armies disappeared in encirclements so vast they barely fit on a map. But the victory was an illusion. Every mile gained stretched German supply lines thinner. Trucks broke down, fuel ran low, and food vanished before it reached the front. The Wehrmacht had planned for a sprint. Instead, they were running a marathon across a continent. Behind them, Soviet villagers set their homes on fire, burned their crops, and poisoned their wells, leaving nothing for the invaders but smoke and hunger. Stalin's brutal, scorched earth policy was working. By late summer, Hitler made a fateful mistake. Instead of striking straight for Moscow, he split his forces. Some toward Leningrad, others south to the oil fields of the Caucasus. His generals protested, but he ignored them. He trusted his will more than their experience. It was a decision that shattered the momentum of the Blitzkrieg and gave the Red Army time to recover. Then came the rain. Endless, sticky mud swallowed trucks and tanks alike. Roads turned to rivers of clay. Soldiers pushed their own vehicles through the muck, boots torn, faces hollow from exhaustion. And behind the rain waited something worse, the Russian winter. The temperature plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Rifles froze, engines died, and men collapsed in the snow beside their silent machines. By December, the German army stood at the gates of Moscow, frozen, starving, and out of time. The Soviets, reinforced by fresh troops from Siberia, counterattacked with a ferocity the Germans had never seen. For the first time, Hitler's army was forced to retreat. In his headquarters, Hitler refused to believe what was happening. He shouted orders that ignored reality. No step back. He blamed his generals, his soldiers, anyone but himself. The myth of invincibility, the engine of his empire, began to crack. Operation Barbarossa had been designed to crush the Soviet Union in 3 months. Instead, it opened a second front that would bleed Germany dry for the rest of the war. The Blitzkrieg was dead. In its place stood a nightmare of ice, mud, and endless loss. The storm had turned, and for Hitler, there would be no way back. While German tanks sank into the Russian snow, a very different battle was taking shape far from the front lines. It wasn't fought with guns or bombs. It was fought with machines, sweat, and sheer determination. It was the war of production. As Hitler's armies pushed east, entire Soviet cities packed up and moved. Thousands of trains thundered toward the Ural Mountains, loaded with factory parts, machines, workers, and families. Assembly lines were dismantled piece by piece and rebuilt in freezing fields hundreds of miles away. Women welded tank armor. Children carried bolts and fuel cans through the snow. Engineers slept beside engines to keep them from freezing. The goal was simple: keep the Soviet war machine alive. By the winter of 1941, those new factories began roaring back to life. From the ashes of retreat rose a new industrial heart, one that could produce tanks, planes, and shells faster than Germany could destroy them. The T-34 tank rolled out by the thousands, tough enough to face anything on the battlefield. Soviet Yak fighters filled the skies. Stalin understood what Hitler never did. Wars are not won only by soldiers, but by steel. At the same time, help was crossing the oceans. The United States, still months away from entering the war, had already begun a massive effort known as the Lend-Lease program. Cargo ships sailed through icy Arctic waters, dodging German submarines, to deliver trucks, fuel, food, and raw materials to the Soviet Union. By the end of the war, America would send over 400,000 trucks, 14,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of supplies, an industrial lifeline that turned the tide. While the Soviet Union built behind its mountains, Britain fought to keep the sea routes open. Convoys crossed the Atlantic, hunted by U-boats, but shielded by destroyers and planes. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just about ships. It was about survival. If those convoys stopped, the Allies would starve. They didn't stop. Meanwhile, in Germany, the once unstoppable Reich was beginning to suffocate under its own ambitions. Bombers from Britain and America struck deep into its industrial heart, reducing factories to rubble faster than they could rebuild. Railways broke down, oil supplies vanished, and the sane soldiers who once rolled through Paris now fought with half-empty fuel tanks and frozen rations. Hitler still demanded more weapons, more victories, more miracles. But the truth was clear. The miracle was happening elsewhere. Across the Atlantic, American factories were working 24 hours a day, turning Detroit into an arsenal. In the Soviet Union, the trains never stopped. Every day, the Allies were getting stronger, and Germany was running out of everything. The war that began with lightning attacks had turned into a battle of endurance. And in that kind of war, the side with the most steel, fuel, and food would win. Hitler just didn't know it yet. The next great battle would prove it. A city by the Volga that would become the graveyard of his empire. On the banks of the Volga River stood a city of smoke, steel, and pride. Its name alone was a challenge. Stalingrad, Stalin's city. For Hitler, capturing it wasn't just a military goal. It was personal. To take Stalingrad meant humiliating his greatest rival and proving that Germany still ruled the war. In the summer of 1942, he launched Operation Blue, a massive offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city that bore his enemy's name. German bombers turned Stalingrad into a skeleton of ruins. Buildings collapsed into dust. Streets became rubble-filled trenches. Yet instead of surrendering, the Soviets used those ruins as weapons. Every factory became a fortress, every basement a bunker. The fight moved yard by yard, floor by floor. The defenders had one order: not a step back. The Germans advanced, but every block they gained cost them hundreds of lives. The Luftwaffe could no longer bomb freely. The front was too close, the enemy too entangled. As winter approached, Hitler's Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, found itself trapped in a frozen maze of destruction. Ammunition was running out, temperatures plunged below freezing, and men starved among the ruins. Hitler ordered them to hold at any cost. Surrender was forbidden. But then, in November, the Soviets struck back with Operation Uranus. Their counterattack encircled 300,000 German soldiers. The hunters had become the hunted. The Luftwaffe tried to resupply the trapped army by air, but it was hopeless. Planes crashed or were shot down. Food and fuel never arrived. Inside the pocket, discipline collapsed. Soldiers ate horses, leather, even sawdust bread. When Paulus finally surrendered in February 1943, the invincible Wehrmacht had been destroyed. Only 90,000 men survived to march into captivity. Most would never return. Stalingrad was more than a defeat. It was the moment the world realized Germany could lose. But Hitler still refused to accept it. Desperate for redemption, he ordered one last grand offensive, Operation Citadel, targeting a bulge in the Soviet line. For a week, the fields of Kursk became hell itself. In Prokhorovka, over 1,000 tanks clashed at point-blank range. Smoke blackened the horizon. The ground trembled under the weight of steel and fire. When it was over, Germany had lost its last chance to regain the initiative. The mighty panzer divisions were broken, and the Wehrmacht would never again go on the offensive. Stalingrad shattered Hitler's illusion of invincibility. Kursk buried it. From that point forward, Germany could only retreat, step by step, mile by mile, back to the heart of the Reich. By the spring of 1945, Berlin was a skeleton city. Smoke drifted through shattered streets, and the thunder of Soviet artillery never stopped. The empire that once promised 1,000 years had barely survived 12. The Third Reich was dying, not with a final triumph, but with a slow, chaotic collapse. The Red Army closed in from the east, while American and British forces advanced from the west. Hitler's generals begged him to evacuate the capital, but he refused. In his underground bunker, pale and trembling, he still believed victory was possible, that some miracle weapon or sudden betrayal would save him. He moved imaginary divisions on maps, commanding armies that no longer existed. Outside, boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Home Guard were fighting tanks with rifles. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet shells were already falling on the city. The streets of Berlin became a maze of fire and desperation. Civilians hid in basements, whispering prayers or listening to the earth shake above them. Food was gone, water was scarce, and the smell of burning hung everywhere. Still, Nazi propaganda insisted that salvation was near. But reality had caught up. On April 25th, Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe River, splitting Germany in two. The circle around Berlin was complete. Inside his bunker, Hitler raged at the betrayal of his generals, convinced that the world had turned against him. He appointed new ministers, issued new decrees. None of it mattered. The Reich was already finished. On April 30th, with Soviet troops just blocks away, Hitler made his final decision. In a dim room deep beneath the chancellery, he took a pistol, sat beside his companion Eva Braun, and ended his life. Their bodies were burned in the garden above, just as he had ordered. Hours later, Joseph Goebbels poisoned his own children and followed his Führer into death. Within days, the remaining German forces surrendered. The war in Europe was over. When Allied soldiers entered the concentration camps, they found what the world could barely imagine: mountains of bodies, survivors who looked like shadows, and the full horror of the Holocaust exposed to the light. The dream of empire had become a crime against humanity. Hitler had promised greatness, but left behind only ruin. On May 8th, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. Across the world, people cheered, cried, and mourned. The guns finally fell silent, but the scars remained. Hitler had lost not just a war, he had lost his war against truth, against humanity itself. His empire of hate had devoured its creator. And yet, even among the ruins, one truth stood clear: no power built on fear and cruelty can endure. History always catches up. It always remembers. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy uncovering the real stories behind the rise and fall of empires, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments what moment from history you want to explore next. The Texas sun didn't care about the war. It beat down on the land just the same, hot, dry, and endless. When the truck stopped outside a small town west of Austin, a group of weary German prisoners climbed out, blinking into the blinding light. Their boots sank into red dust. The air smelled of hay, sweat, and something unfamiliar: freedom. They had been captured in North Africa and Europe, shipped across the Atlantic on crowded transports for weeks. They'd heard rumors whispered in the dark. Americans torture prisoners. They make them dig graves. They feed them scraps. But now, standing in the middle of a Texas ranch, none of that seemed true. There were no whips, no shouting guards, only cowboys in wide hats, their rifles slung loosely, ropes hanging from their saddles. One of them, a tall man with sunburned cheeks, tipped his hat and said through a translator, "You boys will be helping out here. Fences, cattle, whatever needs doing." The Germans stared. Work? On a ranch? It sounded like a trick. Their minds raced back to the propaganda posters they'd seen at home. America painted as a land of greed and chaos, full of criminals and machines. But what they saw was quiet order. Horses moving slowly in the heat. Windmills spinning lazily in the distance. No fear, no chaos. Just work waiting to be done. That first day felt like stepping into another world. The prisoners were led to a bunkhouse, plain, wooden, but clean. There was running water, cots with real blankets, and when the dinner bell rang, they followed their noses to the mess hall, where plates of beef stew, bread, and even pie waited on long tables. No one shouted at them to eat. No one guarded them closely. The Americans sat on the same benches, talking easily, laughing at jokes the Germans didn't understand. One cowboy nodded toward them and said, "Eat up, fellas. You've got a long day tomorrow." The Germans looked down at their plates, stunned. They had expected chains and cruelty. Instead, they were being fed better than soldiers at the front. That night, as the sky turned purple over the plains, one of the prisoners whispered, "This isn't a prison, it's another world." And for the first time, they began to wonder if everything they had been told about America had been a lie. The war had brought them here as enemies. But under the Texas sky, the first cracks were forming in that idea. What began with fear was already turning into disbelief, and soon into curiosity. The next morning, a bugle call broke the silence, but it wasn't harsh. The prisoners lined up, half expecting shouts or inspections. Instead, a calm American sergeant handed out work lists. "You'll earn credits for each day," he said. "Use them in the canteen. Coffee, cigarettes, whatever you need." The men stared, confused. Paid work? For prisoners? It sounded impossible. The truth was simple. America followed rules. The Geneva Convention, written after the last World War. Prisoners had to be treated with dignity, given food, shelter, even pay for labor. But for the Germans, raised on a system built by fear, this discipline without cruelty was more shocking than any punishment. At breakfast, they were served eggs, toast, and hot coffee. One man whispered, "This can't be real." In Germany, his family was living on turnips and bread made with sawdust. Yet here, even captives were eating better than free civilians back home. The workdays were long, but structured. Fences needed repair, cattle needed feeding, and irrigation ditches needed clearing. The cowboys gave orders without shouting, teaching with gestures and patience. "If you do it right," one said, "you only have to do it once." That kind of logic impressed the Germans. It was efficiency, not emotion, something they understood, but done with a lightness they had never seen before. Slowly, the men began to notice how everything around them ran on quiet order. Trucks arrived on time, Food was delivered in abundance. Tools were always available. It was a machine, but not the kind powered by fear. It ran on trust. One afternoon, the prisoners watched the foreman fix a broken windmill. He didn't call for help or bark instructions. He climbed the tower himself, whistling as he worked. When he came down, one of the Germans said softly, "In our army, he'd have a dozen men to do that for him." The cowboy just shrugged. "Here, you do your own fixing." That attitude was contagious. The Germans, used to strict ranks, began to take pride in small things done well. A repaired fence, a polished tool, a neat stable. Work stopped feeling like punishment and started to feel like purpose. At night, some wrote letters home, trying to explain the strange order of this place. One wrote, "They do not rule us by fear, but by fairness. It is more effective than any whip." What they didn't realize yet was that this quiet, confident system, the American way of doing things, was already working on them, breaking down walls built by propaganda, one sunrise at a time. By the second week, the shock had worn off, replaced by something new: routine. The Germans rose with the sun, ate breakfast, and rode out in the backs of dusty pickup trucks to whatever part of the ranch needed hands that day. Some fixed broken fence lines. Others hauled feed. A few were even trusted to handle horses, though most had never touched one before. At first, it was chaos. They hammered nails backward, dropped buckets, and shouted orders in German that no one understood. The cowboys watched with quiet amusement. "You boys ever seen a fence before?" one asked, grinning. When a young prisoner tried to lift a feed sack too heavy for him, the foreman simply said, "Don't fight it, son. Use leverage." Then he showed him how. That moment said everything. These Americans didn't humiliate the prisoners. They taught them. Every mistake became a lesson. Every lesson a small bridge across the divide between captor and captive. Texas ranch life was hard, even for the locals. The sun burned through clothes, the wind carried dust that stuck to your teeth, and the cattle never cooperated. But the Germans quickly learned that complaining got them nowhere. Out here, respect was earned with sweat. Days turned into weeks. The men grew stronger, leaner, more capable. The first time they helped move a herd into the pens without chaos, the cowboys clapped and shouted, "Now you're thinking like Texans." The prisoners laughed, half embarrassed, half proud. They were starting to belong, not as equals, but as part of the machine that kept the ranch alive. Work became something they could measure. A fixed fence, a fed herd, a clean stall, tangible results that replaced the empty slogans of war. One man later wrote in his diary, "It is strange. Here I am a prisoner, yet I feel more useful than I ever did as a soldier." Evenings were quiet. After supper, the cowboys and guards sat around the fire, tuning guitars and telling stories. The Germans listened, sometimes catching a word or two. One night, someone started humming Lily Marlene, the song every soldier in Europe knew. To everyone's surprise, one of the cowboys joined in. The mix of English and German verses hung in the warm air, and for a moment, the war felt far away. The next morning, things went on as usual. Dust, cattle, fences, but something subtle had shifted. The cowboys no longer said the prisoners, they said the boys. And the Germans stopped calling the Americans the enemy. They called them the cowboys. They had come to Texas as soldiers, proud and broken. But through hard work, simple meals, and unexpected kindness, they were becoming something else entirely. Ranch hands who understood that freedom didn't always mean escape. By the fall of 1944, the rhythm of Texas life had settled deep into the prisoners' bones. The mornings began with the rattle of tin plates and the smell of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They had stopped asking for permission to eat, and the cowboys had stopped watching them so closely. Trust had quietly replaced fear. The Germans had expected discipline through punishment. What they found was discipline through pride. Cowboys didn't take orders. They took responsibility. A man's word was his bond, and laziness was the only real sin. The prisoners noticed that even the youngest ranch hand carried himself like his own boss. No one saluted, no one barked commands, but everything still got done. Around the fire at night, the cultural gap slowly closed. Cowboys told stories about droughts, cattle drives, and high school football games. The Germans listened, amused by how casual Americans were about hardship. One of them joked, "You talk about tornadoes like we talk about rain." The cowboys laughed. "Well, out here, both'll ruin your day if you don't respect them." Food was another revelation. Meals on the ranch weren't just about eating. They were about belonging. Breakfast meant biscuits, eggs, and bacon. Lunch meant chili or stew, sometimes steak. For men who had spent years eating thin soup at the front, this was abundance beyond imagination. Even the small freedoms felt enormous. After long days, guards sometimes let the Germans ride horses for practice. They were awkward at first. Boots too big, reins too tight. But they learned. The wide open land gave them a sense of movement they hadn't felt since before the war. Language barriers began to fade, replaced by gestures, laughter, and new words. The Germans picked up phrases like y'all, fixin' to, and partner. The cowboys teased them good-naturedly when they used them wrong. One man said, "You sound more Texan than I do, Fritz." Letters home told the story no propaganda could deny. "We are prisoners," one wrote, "but they treat us like men. They feed us, joke with us, and sometimes they even forget to guard us." His mother, reading in bombed-out Munich, refused to believe it. How could the enemy show kindness when her own government only spoke of cruelty? For the prisoners, the greatest shock wasn't the food or the freedom. It was the equality. Cowboys treated them not as inferiors, but as workers who shared the same sun, the same fatigue, and the same need for a cup of coffee at the end of the day. One night, a cowboy leaned back against a fence post and said, "Ain't no winners in war, boys, only survivors." The Germans didn't answer, but they understood. In that simple phrase, they heard the heart of America, a belief that strength didn't need to boast. It just worked hard, helped others, and kept moving. By now, the prisoners had stopped dreaming of escape. What they wanted, more than anything. Spring 1945. The war in Europe was ending, and the Texas plains were turning green again. Calves were being born, wildflowers covered the fields, and yet the air at the ranch felt heavier each day. The Germans had heard whispers, Berlin surrounded, Hitler dead, the Reich collapsing. No one celebrated. They just kept working, fixing fences and feeding cattle, waiting for the truth. Then one afternoon, the trucks rolled up. The foreman, Frank Callahan, stepped out holding a folded newspaper. "It's over," he said simply. The men froze. After years of fighting, surrender didn't feel like victory or defeat. It felt like silence. That night, the ranch was quiet. The cowboys brewed coffee and sat with the prisoners one last time. Nobody talked about politics or war. They talked about families, the weather, and the long trip home. When someone asked what would happen next, Frank just said, You'll go home and start over. That's what we all gotta do. A few days later, the Germans packed their things. Letters, photos, a few handmade trinkets. Frank walked up to one of them, a young man named Hans, and handed him a small paper-wrapped parcel. Inside was a Stetson hat. "So you don't forget Texas," he said with a smile. Hans couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears filling his eyes. As the trucks pulled away, the men looked back through the slats, watching the ranch shrink into the horizon. The barns, the windmill, the cowboys waving their hats. For many, that was the last image of America they would ever see. Months later, when their ship reached Germany, the contrast was unbearable. The docks were in ruins, cities were rubble, families scattered. The prisoners returned home to a country that had lost everything except the lessons they carried inside. They had seen a different kind of power, one that came not from control, but from confidence. In Texas, they had learned that leadership didn't need fear, that abundance could come from fairness, and that even enemies could share a table. Many never forgot it. Some former POWs wrote letters to the ranchers who had fed them. A few returned years later as immigrants, eager to live in the land that had once held them captive. Others stayed in Germany and rebuilt farms, factories, and towns with a new understanding of efficiency and freedom, the American way they had witnessed firsthand. One ex-prisoner summed it up years later: "We lost the war, but in Texas, we saw how a nation could win peace." And maybe that was the quiet victory no one wrote about. The one won not with bombs or tanks, but with decency, hard work, and a cup of coffee shared between former enemies. If stories like this remind you how small acts of humanity can outlast any war, give this video a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more true stories from history that still matter today. The Texas sun didn't care who had won or lost. It burned the same for everyone. A line of German prisoners stepped down from the back of an army truck, squinting against the glare. Their boots crunched on dry gravel. These were men captured in North Africa and Europe, soldiers who had faced tanks, sandstorms, and bombers. They had been told that American prison camps were brutal places filled with hunger and punishment. But what they saw was cattle. Across the open plain stood a man in a wide-brimmed hat, rope slung over his shoulder, boots dusty from the trail. A cowboy. He tipped his hat and spoke through a translator. "You boys will be helping us work the ranch. Fence mending, cattle drives, whatever needs doing." The Germans exchanged confused glances. Work the ranch? No barking guards? No cells? Just cows? Within a day, they found themselves riding in pickup trucks, trailing herds through shimmering heat. Cowboys whistled, yelled, and laughed as they guided the animals. The prisoners watched in disbelief. These Americans didn't look like conquerors. They looked like men who knew the land and respected it. Instead of rifles, the prisoners were handed work gloves. Instead of shouted orders, they got calm directions. A cowboy showed one of them how to fix a fence, pointing and gesturing until the young soldier understood. It was hard work, hammering posts, hauling wire, breathing dust. But it was human. Meals were another surprise. Instead of thin soup, they were given real food: meat, potatoes, coffee strong enough to jolt a man awake. Some hadn't tasted beef in years. Around the mess tables, the prisoners ate silently at first, unsure if it was a trick. But as the days passed, suspicion turned to quiet amazement. One young German stared at the endless horizon and muttered, "This isn't imprisonment. This is another life." He wasn't wrong. The ranch was fenced, yes, and guarded, but it wasn't a cage. The open range stretched farther than the eye could see. an ocean of grass and sky. There was no barbed wire that could contain that feeling of space. Many of the cowboys were just regular Texans, too young or too old to serve overseas. They didn't care about politics or propaganda. They cared if a man could pull his weight. "If you can work, you're all right," one said with a shrug. For the Germans, it was the first crack in the image they'd been fed for years. The enemy wasn't cruel or chaotic. He was steady, friendly, and most shocking of all, fair. By the end of that first week, the prisoners had sunburns, blisters, and stories they could hardly believe. They had expected to suffer. Instead, they were working side by side with men who treated them not as enemies, but as hands, temporary ranch workers in the middle of a war. And under that vast, endless sky, one thought began to spread quietly through the camp. Maybe everything they had been told about America was wrong. By 1943, the Allies had a problem no one expected: too many prisoners. From the deserts of North Africa to the fields of Sicily, thousands of German soldiers were surrendering every week. Britain was full, its camps overflowing, so the United States offered a solution: ship them across the ocean, far from the war, to a place with space, food, and sunshine. That place was Texas. It made perfect sense. Texas had land, isolation, and an agricultural economy that desperately needed hams. Trains carrying German POWs rolled inland from the ports of Houston and Galveston, their windows barred but open to the view. Through them, the prisoners saw something that didn't fit their expectations: towns untouched by war, fields of cotton and wheat, stores full of food, and children playing in front yards. Back home, German cities were burning. Here, life went on. Many of the men whispered in disbelief. The Nazi newspapers had described America as a land of chaos and crime, a place collapsing under greed and corruption. But the America outside those train windows was calm and rich. No bombed-out ruins, no shortages, no fear. When the trains stopped near towns like Herne, Huntsville, or Bastrop, the prisoners braced for punishment. They expected beatings, starvation, maybe even execution. Instead, they were met with military discipline, but also order and fairness. The camps followed the Geneva Convention, something most Germans had only heard about. Prisoners had to be given shelter, medical care, and enough food to stay healthy. They received soap, clothing, and 3 full meals a day. There were guard towers and fences, yes, but inside those fences were soccer fields, libraries, and even classes run by fellow prisoners. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't cruelty either. For American authorities, the goal was simple: keep the prisoners busy and useful. The U.S. Army was short on manpower. Millions of American men were overseas. Farms and ranches back home were struggling. The War Department decided that POWs could help. Local farmers and ranchers could hire prisoners through the government, paying wages that went to the Army. The prisoners themselves received small credits they could spend in camp stores on cigarettes, candy, or soap. It was a strange arrangement that worked for everyone. Texans got much-needed labor. The Army reduced its costs. And the Germans, who had expected punishment, found purpose in work. Still, the first weeks were tense. Locals stared when trucks full of enemy soldiers passed by. Some families worried about having Nazis nearby. But those fears faded quickly when people saw who the prisoners really were. Tired young men, barely out of their teens, more like farm boys than fanatics. A few guards even joked that the only danger the Germans posed was eating too much. By the end of the year, nearly 50,000 German POWs were scattered across Texas in dozens of camps. some large military compounds, others small satellite camps built near cotton fields or cattle ranches. It was an invisible army of laborers helping to feed a nation at war. And as they worked, the prisoners began to notice something that no propaganda could hide. America wasn't just strong because of its soldiers. It was strong because of its stability. Because even in wartime, ordinary people kept the land alive. The first morning on the ranch felt unreal. The German prisoners were used to orders, inspections, and shouting. Now, a cowboy pointed toward a pile of fence posts and said just one word: work. The men hesitated. They had fought for the German army, worn uniforms with eagles and swastikas. Now they were being asked to dig holes, haul wire, and fix fences under the Texas sun. Some refused at first, but hunger and boredom are powerful teachers. Within hours, most picked up tools and followed the cowboys' lead. The work was tough. The heat was relentless, the dust thick, the distances endless. A short ride to check cattle could take hours. The longhorns were nothing like the calm dairy cows of Bavaria. They were massive, stubborn, sometimes dangerous. The prisoners learned quickly to stay alert. One young soldier wrote later, "I fought in Tunisia and Sicily, survived bombings and heat. But chasing Texas cattle, this was a new kind of battle." The cowboys were a different kind of teacher. They didn't bark orders or talk about politics. They worked side by side, showing with gestures and patience how to do things right. They fixed fences, roped calves, loaded hay, and expected the Germans to keep up. At first, the cowboys kept their distance. Many had lost brothers or friends overseas. They didn't know what to make of the enemy working in their fields. But it didn't take long to see these Nazis weren't monsters. They were just skinny young men trying to get through the day. "Out here," one cowboy said later, "work made us all the same." By the end of the first week, the prisoners' hands were blistered, their backs sore, but their pride was returning. They were doing real work again, something that mattered. In a strange way, the ranch gave them dignity. Meals became moments of quiet connection. Cowboys brought food out to the fields: beans, cornbread, strong coffee. The prisoners ate gratefully, still amazed at how much there was to go around. Some shared jokes in broken English and German, laughing over hand gestures and mistakes. Every now and then, the guards turned a blind eye while a prisoner tried his hand at riding a horse. It didn't always end well. But those moments, the laughter, the dust, the open sky, felt like tiny pieces of freedom. The more they worked, the more they noticed a pattern. The cowboys respected hard work more than rank. A man who could rope a steer or fix a fence earned trust. No one cared where you were born or what uniform you once wore. For soldiers raised in a world of strict rules and hierarchy, this was shocking. Freedom here wasn't about orders, it was about responsibility. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, a prisoner looked across the pasture and said quietly, "They don't treat us like enemies. They treat us like men." That simple truth spread through the camp faster than any rumor. For the first time, these German soldiers began to see America not as a threat, but as a mystery worth understanding. A country where even the enemy could share a laugh over a fence post and a cup of coffee. War had taught the German prisoners to measure strength in weapons and victories. But in Texas, they learned a different kind of math, one that had nothing to do with guns. It started with food. Back home, families survived on watery soup and black bread. At the front, soldiers ate just enough to keep moving. But in Texas, even prisoners were fed like farmhands. Every day brought meat, potatoes, vegetables, and thick coffee that never seemed to run out. Some men stared at their plates, unable to believe it was real. One wrote in his diary, "I have never eaten so much in my life, not even as a free man." The meals told a story that propaganda couldn't hide. If America could feed its prisoners this well, what was it doing for its own citizens and soldiers? Then came the land. Texas seemed endless. The ranches stretched for miles, dotted with cattle herds so large they looked like moving rivers of brown and white. A German farm back home might have 20 cows. Here, a single rancher had thousands. The prisoners began to realize that America's strength wasn't just in factories or weapons. It was in sheer scale. Everywhere they looked, there was proof of plenty. Tractors rumbling across fields, trucks hauling feed, barns packed with grain. The numbers were staggering. Millions of acres under cultivation, tens of millions of cattle. And this was only one state. At night, the prisoners whispered about what they'd seen. "If this is how much food one ranch makes," one said, "how can Germany ever win?" The more they worked, the clearer it became. America's power was built on efficiency. Nothing went to waste. Broken tools were fixed. Work was shared. A fence repaired in time could save a whole herd. It wasn't military discipline that kept things running. It was common sense and cooperation. Even the smallest details shocked them. Their labor was paid for, 80 cents a day, credited to the U.S. Army, with a few cents given back as canteen tokens. They could buy cigarettes, candy, or soda. It was more than many German civilians could afford in 1944. And when the guards handed out newspapers, the truth became impossible to ignore. American factories were producing tanks, planes, and ships at a rate Germany couldn't imagine. In 1944 alone, the U.S. built nearly 100,000 aircraft. Even the ranches seemed part of that same unstoppable machine, feeding soldiers, workers, and now even their enemies. The Germans didn't talk about it openly, but the realization spread quietly. America wasn't winning the war just with soldiers. It was winning with systems, with food, energy, and organization on a scale the Reich could never match. One officer admitted years later, "We thought America was soft, but in Texas, we saw its real power. It wasn't the army. It was the land, the work." For the men sweating under the Texas sun, that lesson hit harder than any defeat. The math of war had changed. Victory wasn't about who could shout louder or march straighter. It was about who could build more, feed more, and last longer. And under those endless skies, the prisoners learned that America's greatest weapon wasn't force. It was abundance. When the war finally ended in 1945, the German prisoners packed their things and prepared to go home. But home wasn't what it used to be. The Germany they returned to was a country in ruins. Cities bombed to dust, bridges collapsed, railways broken, families scattered. Many stepped off trains and barely recognized their own towns. For men who had spent the last years in Texas, the shock was overwhelming. They had lived as prisoners with more food, comfort, and stability than their families had ever known in wartime. One former POW wrote, "I came back to Germany a free man, but poorer than when I was a prisoner." That contrast left a mark. The prisoners brought something back with them. Lessons learned not from generals, but from cowboys. They had seen how Americans worked, efficient, practical, and confident. They had watched men fix broken tools instead of throwing them away, plan their work before starting, and treat labor as a badge of pride, not humiliation. On Texas ranches, they'd learned that freedom and discipline could exist together, that respect was earned by skill and effort, not by rank or ideology. In the years that followed, many of those former POWs became farmers, engineers, or small business owners in the new West Germany. They used what they'd seen, better ways to organize, to produce, to rebuild. Some even introduced American farming methods like crop rotation and modern ranching techniques. They also carried back a new idea of fairness. Cowboys had treated them like men, not enemies. Guards had enforced rules, yes, but with a sense of humanity. That memory challenged everything Nazi propaganda had told them about America. For many, it became proof that dignity didn't depend on power. It came from how people treated each other. Letters began crossing the ocean. Former prisoners wrote to ranchers who had fed them, to guards who'd shared cigarettes, to families who had shown kindness. Some were invited back. A few even immigrated permanently, settling in the same Texas towns where they'd once been held captive. Their stories spread quietly through post-war Germany. They spoke not of defeat, but of understanding, how a country's real strength could come from openness, not fear. That idea found its way into the rebuilding of a new Germany, one that focused on cooperation, production, and freedom instead of conquest. When historians later called it the German economic miracle, few mentioned the role of former POWs. But those men knew. They had seen abundance in action. They had seen how a society could rebuild by trusting work over words, efficiency over slogans. Years later, one old prisoner wrote, "The cowboys showed me something our leaders never did, that freedom works best when it's shared." The barbed wire and guard towers are long gone now, but the lessons that crossed the Atlantic with those men never disappeared. They became part of the quiet connection between two former enemies who learned through hard work and simple decency that respect can outlast any war. If you enjoyed this story about humanity in the middle of chaos, don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore more hidden chapters of World War II history with us. Sometimes, the most powerful victories happen far from the battlefield.